Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 30th of April, and I know that I haven't been uploading for a while. That's due to extenuating circumstances, but now I'm back and hopefully I'll be able to upload more regularly for the coming weeks. And so today we're going to be talking about the situation in Bakhmut. I'm going to try to recap what's occurred since I last made an update. Also, you can see that the map is different now because there was no blue polygon. This is because the blue and red polygons were overlapping, which made it really look very ugly. So I'm going to try to fix that in the coming days. But let's talk about the situation in Bakhmut starting around the 24th of April. So at the time, the situation with the front line looked something like this, you could say, where basically the dividing line in the north was around some apartment buildings. Looked something like this. And there was a lot of fighting going on to the north of the warehouses. So in a lot of these residential areas to the north. Then there was also the dividing line of the rail line, which was really separating the Russian and the Ukrainian forces. And then if we go further south, the dividing line was somewhere around the residential areas. So this is how the situation looked like roughly around a week ago. And since then, the Russians have been pushing, first of all, across the rail line. They crossed the rail line, fighting in the train station, fighting in some apartment buildings, taking over those very important firing positions. This was done mainly by the Wagner Group. Then in the north, at the same time, they launched a two-pronged attack to take over the remaining residential areas. So they were able to secure them. The Ukrainians, they were defending these very heavily fortified warehouses and garages that have been mined by Ukrainian sappers around here. But again, due to the fact that the Russians were attacking on multiple axes, the Ukrainians did not have enough resources to hold them back, and as a result, around the 26th, the Ukrainians were forced to withdraw from their defensive fortifications over here, which were sort of like a vanguard in order to hold back the Russians as they were continuing to fortify the main defensive node in western Bakhmut, which is this apartment complex area over here that I'm circling. And so the Russians, they were able to push using their two-pronged attack from the north and from the east to take over the warehouses, and this gave them an avenue to begin attacking the apartment complexes. And so you can see how I'm drawing this arrow showing how the Russians were advancing towards the south, and the Ukrainians, they actually continued to hold on to some buildings to the north of the apartment complex. And so in this northern area, first of all, you have some residential areas. A lot of these are basically leveled by the artillery and just the constant fighting that's been going on here for months. And then you have some buildings that still have their skeletal structure. They're still standing in a way, and so they're still very good as firing positions. And so a lot of fighting has been going on over here over the past few days as the Russians have been trying to clear out Ukrainian firing positions to the north of the apartment complexes. As of today, the 30th, the Russians have finally been successful in this regard, and now all of this circled area that I have circled in red is under Russian control, and the new front line is directly adjacent to the main Ukrainian defensive node, the apartment complexes in this case. And you can see that the road dividing the Russians and the Ukrainians is this road that's very difficult to pronounce, Vyzhov Teliv Donbass Street, something like that. Apologize for butchering that name, but that is basically the situation around here. And then at the same time, recall how the Russians had been spending weeks trying to clear out some apartment complexes that aren't as large as the ones in the south, the main defensive node, but they are still pretty sizable, like 3 to 4 stories. So around here, this entire square, and a lot of fighting was going on here. So once the Russians were able to successfully clear out these positions, it made it much easier for them to advance further to the south and further to the west and take over some of the less dense residential areas with gardens. And so that's what they've been doing over the past week or so, pushing in this southwestern direction. And now the front line is centered around this road over here. Let's see what it's called. I don't have the name over here, but you can see how the Russians are pushing along Tolbuhina Street, Levchenko Street, Peremoha Street. And again, these are the more suburban parts of Bakhmut on the western outskirts. This is important because this again gives the Russians a new avenue to attack the apartment defensive node. They can try to flank it from the west and then attack from there, which is an area that's been probably unexpected because that's the area around the supply lines that enter Bakhmut. It's not really an area where the front line has been relatively close to, but now that's beginning to change. The Russians are trying to envelop the apartment node on all sides, and so they already have control of the northern flank, they already have control of the eastern flank, and now they're trying to advance through the more spread out residential areas to the northwest, and that could give them potentially an opportunity to flank the apartment complex from the west as well. And then again, they'll be able to squeeze out the Ukrainians like they've been doing basically for every single defensive node within Bakhmut over the past half a year. And so at the same time, the Russians have also been trying to apply pressure onto Kromove, but I think this is more so done in order to spread out the Ukrainian forces because there has not been a serious push onto Kromove yet. We know that the Russians in recent weeks have been able to take over trench lines that have been very close to the T-0506 highway that links up with Kromove and then enters Bakhmut. But again, there are some minor routes that circumvent the main T-0506 route, and then they just link up in Kromove again and then enter Bakhmut. So again, Kromove still has a very, very significant advantage for Ukraine. It provides them with a lot of avenues to supply the Ukrainian garrison that remains in Bakhmut, and so that's why we've seen the Russians apply pressure, and a lot of the pressure has been going through this direction over here, this yellow route that I'm going over in red right now. They're trying to push into this area and take over Kromove for that reason, to cut off the supply lines. But due to the fact that there is so much Ukrainian resistance over here, they have a lot of trench lines that have been set up over the past few months. It makes it very, very difficult to just attack it head on, which is why we haven't seen that many gains in the past week. Although I will say that the attacks have been heightened as the Russians continue to inch nearer to taking all of Bakhmut. At the moment, about 10% of Bakhmut is still under Ukrainian control. So let's go further south and see what's been going on around here. So around here, the obvious dividing line is the rail line. But then once you cross that rail line, it's mainly just these more residential blocks, very similar to the Zabakhmurka district in eastern Bakhmut. It's just these one-story houses with gardens, and again, a lot of them are leveled due to the fighting, and so it makes it difficult for Ukraine to conduct a more protracted defense around here, which is why the Wagner Group has been able to push deeper and deeper towards some key supply routes and towards some key defensive nodes. And so just in the past week alone, for instance, the Wagner Group has been able to take over this entire area that I'm going to circle right now. They've been able to take over all of these residential blocks. They've been able to take over a lot of key buildings, and in the process they've been able to cut off Tchaikovskogo Street. So let's zoom in on that. So Tchaikovskogo Street used to be the road that supplied the Ukrainians through the south, so it would link up with Ivanivsky and then push deeper into Bakhmut to supply the Ukrainian garrisons in downtown Bakhmut, for instance. There was also Korsonskogo Street, but the Russians had cut it off, really, you could say, in March, April. So for a while, it's not really been used by the Ukrainians, this road, Korsonskogo Street, but they still had relied on Tchaikovskogo Street. And for that reason, the Ukrainians put a lot of emphasis on defending the southern part of Bakhmut in the southern sector of the current front line. And that's why you can see here that although the Russians have been able to make very significant gains throughout the rest of the front line around Bakhmut, one area where they have not been able to do that is around here. This entire triangle that I'm circling is still under Ukrainian control. And that's because they have so many different units in here stationed that are conducting protracted defenses within apartment buildings, within residential blocks, within stores. And that's all done in order to prevent Tchaikovskogo Street from falling into Russian hands. The thing is, this has failed because the Russians have been able to reach the road a bit further to the north, and they were able to take over this soccer field, take over some different facilities, specifically the industrial college, which is a pretty large structure. It's actually multiple structures, and so there was a lot of fighting going on around here, but the Wagner Group was able to eventually take it over. And then once they took it over, they crossed the road, and eventually they fully cut off both roads that lead deeper into Bakhmut, including Tchaikovskogo Street. And then to fully solidify their gains, they were able to cross the road and take over the nearby Jehovah's Witnesses Kingdom Hall. And so now they have very firm control over at least one point of the road. And that's all that matters, because Ukraine, if they wanted to send supplies, they would not be able to, because there's just one specific area on the road that's been cut off. And so if they wanted to, for instance, supply the apartment complex through the T0504 road that goes from Ivanivsky to Bakhmut, see what's going to happen. You see they're going in, they would obviously be fired upon in this area, but they could still physically cross through the road until they reach this part over here, this part that's under Russian control, drawn in orange red. And so then this basically cuts off direct communication with the Ukrainian garrisons further to the north within the apartment complexes. And so this is actually a big development, and it also further isolates the sizable Ukrainian grouping in southern Bakhmut, because now the Russians are beginning to envelop this grouping as well. Because again, you have the foothold in the north, which is the sort of like the northern flank. To the east, you have the Russian push that's around Khorsand's Congo streets that has been relatively kept at bay. And then again, from the south, you have the push that again has been prevented from succeeding due to the Ukrainian resources that have been diverted to holding the line around Khorsand's Congo streets. But now you have basically three different axes of attack, and the Ukrainian forces are now more isolated in this area. They may be forced to pull out in the coming days, or else they will be encircled. And this is not an unlikely story. This has happened numerous times in Bakhmut, where Russians have attacked on numerous different axes and just squeeze the Ukrainians out in the last moment. So something similar could occur over here. And again, something similar, as I said before, could occur on a larger scale within the Ukrainian apartment complexes, because this area is about, let's say, 1 kilometer in length and 1 kilometer in width. So it is a very dense area. It's not that sizable. It's just several dozen apartment buildings tightly packed together. So any sort of infantry push into the roads over here would be met with a lot of fire from Ukrainian forces, Ukrainian ATGMs, Ukrainian small arms fire that would be hitting armored columns, that would be hitting Russian infantry if they were just to infiltrate head on. And so the more likely option is that the Russians would utilize their Air Force capabilities, specifically their FAB 500s and their FAB 1500s, that have precision guidance kits that are very similar to the American JDAM kits that is able to make their rounds precise. And so this takes an unguided missile like the FAB 500 that has a very large diameter and has, again, a very explosive warhead, and makes it much more potent because it now has a precision guidance system. So it could very precisely hit Ukrainian targets within these apartment complexes and destroy concrete fortifications, destroy very durable buildings, which would basically render Ukraine's defense over here useless after a certain time period, because the Russians wouldn't even have to attack it head on. They would just be able to fire upon it with their Air Force, and they'd be able to circumvent any sort of fighting within here, so they would be able to spare casualties and move on. Or the Ukrainians could see the writing on the wall, and once the situation becomes desperate enough, they will just retreat on their own towards the next defensive line outside of Bakhmut. And so that's also a possibility that I've seen floated, because the Ukrainians are aware of the threat of the FAB 500s. And so, yeah, that's the situation around Bakhmut at the moment. But at the same time, there's also a lot of talk about Russian airstrikes that are going on. And so I don't know what's been going on as of the last 30 minutes, just because I've been recording this video, but I will give a quick rundown of what we know as of now in relation to these Russian strikes, because a lot of people are saying that these are some of the most significant strikes that have been launched by the Russians since the beginning of the war. So at the moment, there are air raid sirens in every single Ukrainian oblast, and that includes sirens within the capital city of Kiev, where you have a lot of people that are hiding in the subways right now underground, trying to find cover from any sort of potential missile strike. And so it's being reported that there was a massive barrage of cruise and hypersonic missiles launched. And just as an example, a lot of reports have been talking about the KH-555 missiles, and these are air-launched cruise missiles. And at the same time, there were also KH-1 cruise missiles that were launched. And these are usually launched from strategic bombers such as the Tu-160 and the Tu-95. So in all likelihood, these were probably launched in the airspace above Crimea, and then from there, they hit their respective targets within Ukraine. And in terms of the targets mentioned, there were some in Kharkiv, some Mykolaiv, Odessa. Let me actually circle that. So here's Kharkiv, here's Mykolaiv, here's Odessa. And then also sirens reported in Kiev, although we don't know if there were any sort of specific targets hit in that specific city. Now, we also know that there were Caliber cruise missiles launched by the Black Sea Fleet, and this comes after, of course, you had the Ukrainian drone strike on the oil refineries in Sevastopol, which certainly would hinder some of the Russian military and the Russian Navy, their fuel capabilities. But again, it also seems like the timing sort of is connected to that strike by the Ukrainians, where they utilized 2 drones to attack the Russian oil refineries. It almost seems like it's as a response to that Ukrainian attack, all of these airstrikes that are going on at the moment. And so at the moment, there's reports that there are between 10 to 17 Tu-95s that are airborne near the Ukrainian border. And just remember that each Tu-95 could carry up to 6 missiles, up to 6 cruise missiles. So there is a potential for a lot of different missiles to be launched. And in terms of the rumors, I can't confirm any of this. Rumors from the Russian side say that there have been about 120 missiles launched by the Russians. Although, if this were true, I would expect to see way more video footage than what I've seen at the moment. I've seen really just videos of sirens, of a few explosions, but not enough of any impact to indicate that there has been that many missiles launched. Now, of course, some of them could have been intercepted by the Ukrainians, so we're going to have to wait and see what the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense says in that regard, because they always give their claims for how many missiles they have intercepted. And also, we know that there are very strict laws in Ukraine in relation to video footage being released from the scene of airstrikes. And so, one example of a strike that occurred before this current barrage started about an hour or two ago from the recording of this video. So basically, in Eastern time standards, it's basically the night of the 30th, but it's sort of like dawn in Ukraine and Russia. But nonetheless, one very notable example of an airstrike that occurred before this current barrage is the one in Pavlohrad, which has really been circulating throughout social media. There's been a lot of videos attributed to this strike. I can't confirm every single one of them. A lot of them may be old footage that is now being attributed to this new incident. But here is basically what occurred in this area. So, in essence, there was an explosion and massive fire in the city of Pavlohrad. And it's been going on for hours, by the way. It's very difficult to stop. And so, a lot of claims from the Russian side are saying that there have been 16 S-300 batteries destroyed in the area. In addition, a lot of the fuel also exploded. And the warheads of those S-300 air defense systems were prematurely ignited, and that's what caused the secondary explosions due to the Russian strikes, which caused a huge reaction and a huge explosion, huge fires that are being attempted to be put out at least. And so it seems like this entire area had a massive Ukrainian ammo depot, which included a lot of Ukrainian air defense systems that were trying to protect some key Ukrainian targets in the area. And so in terms of the geolocation, I saw one claim that it was near a rail yard in the outskirts of the city, and then another claim that it was near an old chemical plant. But it does seem like the chemical plant is very close to this rail junction, so the two claims may not be contradictory. And so I have the marker there located if you want to see the video for yourself. And so I also looked at the Ukrainian side of things, and on the Ukrainian side, they're saying that there were 38 SS-24 ICBMs that were stored in the area, and that they were not decommissioned. They were just stored there due to a lack of funding, just left there to rot, and that there was 1,800 tons of rocket fuel that was hit as well within the chemical plant, which is now causing a massive explosion. And so this is just one example of Russia ramping up its aerial capabilities, and this is occurring as Ukraine's air defense is diminishing, as a lot of their stockpiles are running out. They're being forced to revert back to a lot of their older Soviet air defense missiles, not even the S-300s or the S-200s. They're having to look back at some of the short or medium range Soviet air defense missiles from 80s and 70s. And so that again will open up the airspaces for the Russians even more than previously was allowed, because a lot of the Russian strikes have been hindered due to the Ukrainian air defenses, not only the Soviet systems but also the NATO systems. But as those are beginning to run out, as we saw with the Pentagon Papers, by around May we're going to see more and more of these Russian strikes, not only in the front line where they can use the glide bombs, but also deeper into Ukraine in places like Pavlohrad. So that's all for today. Thank you guys for watching.